is a faculty which, if honestly developed, will aid in the business advance of either an employer or an employee. It will also lend interest to life in general, and will sharpen one's mental attitude. The observant employer sees where existing conditions in his factory or store should be changed. He observes the characteristics of his men, knows whom to advance, whom to encourage, whom to move from one department to another. He notes where waste of time, labor or material is cutting down efficiency. Observation is a necessary quality in a detective, and an observing employer uses it in discovering such criminals as waste, laziness, opposition and others that rob the plan of profits. Outside of the factory walls, the observation of a Hugh executive is most important. It will tell him what his rivals are doing and what public opinion is developing toward his own concern. In fact, it aids him in discovering the true value of conditions that relate to his business. Of course, observation is not in itself sufficient. It merely is becoming cognizant of things through the senses. Then should follow deduction, or the interpretation of the things observed, and lastly action. The employee should cultivate observation as a trait that will help him to become efficient in his present work and will aid him in his effort to obtain a higher position. And yet the great majority of workmen are woefully lacking in observation. The manager of a machine shop told me an interesting episode illustrating the value of observation as a quality to be practiced by an employee. A young German was operating a machine in my shop several years ago, he said, and while he seemed to be the most industrious, willing and obedient man in the establishment, nevertheless he turned out less work than any of his fellows. I couldn't understand the reason until I stood by and watched him work for more than an hour. Then I observed that he was very clumsy in the way he handled his machine. He seemed to have no knack about him. He made far too many motions, and he lacked system in all that he did. Then I observed the man next to him. He was given to soldiering occasionally, but when he worked he was an expert, in fact the swiftest machinist in the shop. There was a strange contrast between the methods the two men used. I called the younger man into my office at noon and had a talk with him. "You're not turning out enough work, Carl," I said. Disappointment shone in his face, but he said nothing. "Why don't you turn out more work?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied. "How is it that Fred can turn out half again as much as you?" "I don't know." "Did you ever try to find out?" "I mind my own business." "That's a very good policy in some cases," I agreed with him, "but it won't do for all the time." Then I took him into the shop, stationed him behind Fred's machine and told him to stay there all the afternoon and then report to me. When the whistle blew he came to me with a smile on his face. "I know why I do not turn out enough work," he said. "It is because I have not run the machine right." "Very well," I said. "I guess you've learned your first lesson in observation now. I want you to report to me every time you observe anything in this factory that isn't as it should be as far as methods are concerned." It was about a week later when Carl stopped at my office after work. "If you please," he said, "I have a report from observation." Then he went on to explain. "I see Charlie and Jim do not run their machines like Fred," he smiled, "like Fred and me, now. I think you should give them the same lesson in observation you gave me. I find the material we are working with is not handy for us. It is too far from the machines." He showed me a drawing. "This way I think would be better. I learn that I can do the same work all day at the same speed. Fred is nervous. He does better when you give him one work in the morning, another in the afternoon." I observed. He paused and grew red. "All right, Carl, what is it?" "Beg pardon, sir. Maybe I should not say it, but I observe that the men do much better work for you when you are friendly with them, as man to man, than when you scold. Last week you are friendly. You say, 'Good morning, boys,' you praise Charlie for the model he makes, twice you wish us a good night, and you lend Jim a book. We all work for you very well last week. This week I believe something go wrong with you. You scold Charlie and find fault with Fred, although you do not tell him for what. There are no good mornings, no good nights. I mean to mind my own business, but you ask for my observation. We boys loaf this week, sir. I think that's all." I thanked him and made the most of his suggestions. From time to time, he came in with new observations, some of them of no particular use, but enough of them practical to make Carl the most valuable man in the shop. What recalls the story is the fact that he came to see me yesterday afternoon. He's foreman of one of the biggest machine shops in the West now, and he dropped in to see me while on a business trip to this city. You can imagine I was pleased when he recalled his first lesson in observation, and smiled as he concluded, "And yet, I still know how to mind my own business."